through the cemetery, scattering fallen leaves across the weathered headstones. John Harris pulled his coat tighter around his shoulders, his breath forming small clouds that disappeared into the gray sky. He knew the path by heart now. 27 steps from the wrought iron gate. Turn right at the old oak tree. Then another 18 paces to Emily's grave. He'd walked it hundreds of times over the past 3 years, since cancer took her from him in one cruel, unforgiving sweep. The granite headstone stood silent against the backdrop of skeletal trees. Emily Grace Harris, beloved wife, daughter, friend, forever in our hearts. John knelt down, brushing away the light dusting of early snow that had collected on the stone's surface. "Morning, Em," he whispered, the words carried away by the wind. "Happy anniversary." 17 years they would have had today. 17 years of shared coffee on Sunday mornings, of Christmas traditions and summer road trips, of arguments over bills and make-up kisses in the kitchen, of a life built together, brick by brick, memory by memory. Now all he had were echoes of that life, haunting the empty rooms of their house. John placed a small bouquet of white roses, Emily's favorite, against the headstone. His fingers lingered on the cold granite, tracing the letters of her name as if somehow he could reach through stone and time to touch her again. "The house is quiet without you," he continued, his voice rough with emotion. "I still can't sleep on your side of the bed. Claire says I should get a cat or something. But," he sighed, a sound heavy with loneliness, "nobody could replace you." A particularly strong gust of wind sent a flurry of leaves spinning around him. As they settled, something caught his eye, a flash of white nestled between the browning petals of last week's flowers. Frowning, John reached forward. It was an envelope, small and cream-colored, partially hidden among the wilting blooms. His name was written across the front in handwriting so achingly familiar that his heart stumbled in his chest. Emily's handwriting. His fingers trembled as he picked it up. The envelope was sealed, protecting whatever message lay inside from the elements. John's mind raced. Who would leave this here? How long had it been waiting for him? Standing on unsteady legs, he turned the envelope over in his hands. There was no other marking, no clue as to its origin. Just his name, written in the flowing script that had once filled shopping lists and birthday cards throughout their home. The cemetery around him faded away as he carefully opened the envelope, his heart thundering against his ribs. Inside was a single folded sheet of paper. As he unfolded it, his breath caught in his throat. "Dear John, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone. But I need you to know the truth about what I kept from you." The date at the top was exactly 1 week before she died, before the rapid decline that had left no time for final conversations, for proper goodbyes. John's vision blurred, the words swimming before his eyes. He folded the letter quickly, unable to read more, and stuffed it into his coat pocket. His mind reeled with questions. What truth? What had Emily kept from him? Their marriage had been built on honesty, on late-night conversations where they bared their souls to each other. Or so he'd thought. The walk back to his car passed in a daze. John moved mechanically, his body on autopilot while his mind churned with possibilities. The letter burned in his pocket like a live coal. The house was exactly as he'd left it that morning. Dishes from yesterday's dinner still in the sink, mail piled on the counter, dust gathering on the mantel where Emily's picture smiled at him from silver frames. Once, she'd kept their home immaculate. Now, it was a reflection of his inner state, neglected, directionless, slowly decaying. John hung his coat and pulled out the letter, placing it on the kitchen counter as if it might explode. He paced the living room, glancing at it every few seconds. "What did you keep from me, Em?" he murmured to the empty room. They'd shared everything, their hopes, their disappointments, their fears. The cancer diagnosis had come suddenly, a cruel surprise in an otherwise ordinary life. 6 months from diagnosis to death, barely enough time to process what was happening before she was gone. The coffee maker gurgled in the kitchen, filling the house with a familiar aroma that somehow made Emily's absence more pronounced. John poured himself a cup, black and bitter, and sat at the kitchen table, staring at the envelope. Minutes ticked by on the old wall clock, Emily's grandmother's, the one she'd insisted on hanging despite its tendency to run 5 minutes slow. John couldn't bring himself to open the letter again. Not yet. His phone rang, startling him out of his thoughts. Claire's name flashed on the screen. "Hey," he answered, his voice sounding distant even to his own ears. Happy anniversary, his sister said gently. I was just checking in. How are you holding up? John's eyes drifted to the letter on the counter. I don't know. The hesitation in his voice must have alerted Claire. Her tone shifted immediately from sympathetic to concerned. John, what's wrong? He swallowed hard. I found something at the cemetery today. A letter. From Emily. Silence hung between them for a long moment. What does it say? Claire finally asked. I don't know. I can't bring myself to read it yet. He took a shaky breath. The first line says she kept something from me. Some truth. I'm coming over, Claire declared, in the no-nonsense tone that had helped guide him through the worst days after Emily's death. Don't open it until I get there. You shouldn't be alone for this. Before he could protest, she'd hung up. John set his phone down and wrapped his hands around his coffee mug, seeking warmth. The house had never felt so empty, so hollow with possibility and dread. What secret had Emily carried to her grave? And why reveal it now, 3 years later? His eyes drifted to their wedding photo on the wall. Emily radiant in white, her smile wide and genuine as she looked up at him. They'd been so happy, so full of plans for the future. A future that had been cut brutally short. What didn't you tell me? He whispered to her smiling image. Claire arrived 45 minutes later, bringing with her a gust of cold air and the scent of the bakery where she worked. She set a paper bag on the counter, probably containing the cinnamon rolls John usually couldn't resist, and immediately pulled him into a tight hug. I brought comfort food, she said, pulling back to study his face. Her eyes, so like their mother's, were filled with concern. You look awful. Thanks, John replied dryly, attempting a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Coffee, please. As he poured her a cup, Claire spotted the envelope on the counter. She made no move to touch it, respecting its importance. Instead, she took off her coat and settled at the kitchen table, waiting. John handed her the coffee and sat opposite her, the envelope between them like a small white flag of surrender. Maybe it's nothing serious, Claire offered, though her tone suggested she didn't believe it herself. Maybe it's just, I don't know, her thoughts about the afterlife or something. John shook his head. You didn't see the first line. She said she kept something from me. A truth. Claire reached across the table and squeezed his hand. Whatever it is, John, it doesn't change who she was or how much she loved you. You know that, right? Did he? John wasn't sure anymore. The foundation of their relationship, complete honesty, suddenly felt less solid than he'd always believed. What if it's something bad? He asked, voicing the fear that had been growing since he found the letter. What if she, I don't know, had an affair or something? Emily. Claire's incredulity was evident. John, that woman adored you. Anyone could see it. Whatever this is, I'm sure there's a reason she kept it from you. John stared at the envelope, his heart heavy with dread and curiosity in equal measure. Only one way to find out, I guess. With a deep breath, he picked up the letter again and unfolded it fully this time, forcing himself to read beyond the first devastating line. Dear John, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone. But I need you to know the truth about what I kept from you all these years. I've carried this secret like a stone in my heart, and now that I'm facing the end, I can't bear the thought of taking it with me. I've been afraid, John. Afraid of losing you, not to death, but to your own darkness. I've watched you struggle with depression your whole life, seen how hard you fight to stay afloat. I've always worried that one more burden might be the thing that pulls you under for good. That's why I never told you about Thomas. John looked up at Claire, confusion written across his face. Thomas? Do we know a Thomas? Claire shook her head, looking equally puzzled. Keep reading, she urged gently. I should have told you years ago. I almost did, so many times. But then something would happen. Your father would pass away, or you'd have another episode, where things would finally be going well, and I couldn't bring myself to disrupt the fragile peace we'd found. But now time has run out for me, and I can't leave this world without making this right. You deserve the whole truth, even if I'm no longer there to face the consequences. The rest of this story isn't mine alone to tell. Please, talk to Sarah. She's known everything from the beginning. She'll help you understand, and she'll know how to find him. Please forgive me, my love. Everything I did out of love, both for you and for him. Forever yours, Emily. The letter ended there, leaving more questions than answers. John read it twice more, hoping for some clue he'd missed, but the words remained frustratingly vague. "Who the hell is Thomas?" he whispered, his voice catching. "And what does Sarah have to do with this?" Claire looked thoughtful. Sarah was her best friend since college, right? They were close. John nodded absently, his mind racing. Sarah had been Emily's confidant, the keeper of her secrets, secrets he was only now learning existed. "I need to talk to her," he said, already reaching for his phone. "John." Claire's voice was gentle but firm. "It's your anniversary. Maybe give yourself a day before diving into this. Whatever it is, it's waited 3 years. It can wait one more day." But John couldn't wait. The letter had opened a door he hadn't known existed, and now he needed to walk through it, no matter what lay on the other side. "I have to know," he said simply, already scrolling to find Sarah's number. As the phone began to ring, John felt his world tilting on its axis. Whatever truth Emily had kept from him was about to change everything. Sarah didn't answer his call. John stared at his phone in frustration, listening to her voicemail greeting for the third time before hanging up without leaving a message. What could he possibly say? "Hey Sarah, my dead wife left me a mysterious letter about someone named Thomas, and apparently you know all about it. Call me back." Claire watched him from across the kitchen table, concern etched across her face. "Maybe it's for the best," she offered. "You should process this before rushing into anything." But John couldn't sit still. The letter had unleashed something inside him, a desperate need to know, to understand what Emily had kept hidden all those years. He paced the kitchen, the letter clutched in his hand. "I thought we told each other everything," he said, his voice hollow. 17 years together, and there was this whole other thing she never shared. Claire sighed. "People keep secrets for all kinds of reasons, John. It doesn't mean she didn't love you." "But why?" The question burst from him, raw with hurt. "Why wouldn't she trust me with this?" The answer lay in the letter itself. "I've watched you struggle with depression your whole life, seen how hard you fight to stay afloat. I've always worried that one more burden might be the thing that pulls you under for good." John had battled depression since his college years. Emily had been his anchor through the dark episodes, the one constant he could cling to when everything else seemed pointless. Had she really been carrying some secret burden all that time, afraid that sharing it might break him? "I wasn't as fragile as she thought," he muttered. "Weren't you?" Claire's question was gentle but pointed. "After Mom died? After your layoff in 2017? After the miscarriage?" The last word hung in the air between them. Emily had miscarried in their 5th year of marriage, their only pregnancy. They'd tried again for years after, but it never happened. Eventually, they'd made peace with being a family of two. Or had they? Before John could respond, his phone buzzed with a text message. Sarah's name flashed on the screen. "Sorry I missed your call. In a meeting. Everything okay?" John's thumbs hovered over the keyboard. "How to explain? Need to talk to you about Emily. It's important. When can we meet?" The response came quickly. "Tomorrow morning? 10 a.m. at Riverside Coffee?" "I'll be there," John replied. He set the phone down, feeling both relief and apprehension. Tomorrow he would have answers, though whether they were answers he wanted remained to be seen. Claire stayed for dinner, ordering Chinese food neither of them had much appetite for. They avoided talking about the letter, focusing instead on Claire's stories from the bakery and her daughter's upcoming school play. But the unread letter sat between them like an uninvited guest, impossible to ignore completely. When Claire finally left, extracting a promise from John to call her after his meeting with Sarah, the house felt emptier than ever. John wandered from room to room, eventually finding himself in the small home office that had been Emily's space. He rarely came in here anymore. After she died, he'd boxed up most of her things, unable to bear seeing them daily. But her desk remained, along with the bookshelf filled with her favorite novels and medical reference books from her nursing days. John sat in her chair, running his hand over the smooth wood of the desk. Had she written the letter here? Had she sat in this very spot, knowing her time was running out, struggling to find words for a truth she'd hidden for years? On impulse, he opened the desk drawers, not sure what he was looking for. The top drawer contained the usual supplies: pens, paper clips, sticky notes. The second was filled with medical bills and insurance paperwork from her illness, still too painful for him to sort through. The bottom drawer stuck slightly as he pulled it open. Inside were several folders of household documents, warranties, manuals, birth certificates. Beneath them lay a small, leather-bound journal he'd never seen before. John's heart raced as he lifted it out. Emily had never mentioned keeping a journal. He hesitated, feeling like an intruder despite being in his own home. Reading her private thoughts seemed like a violation, and yet, he opened to a random page in the middle, dated 6 years earlier. I saw Thomas today. It wasn't planned, just one of those chance encounters that the universe throws at you when you least expect it. I was leaving the pharmacy, and there he was, walking down Main Street. He's grown so tall, his father's height, but with my eyes. I wonder if he ever thinks about me, if his parents told him he was adopted. I wanted so badly to speak to him, to hear his voice just once. But what right do I have? I gave up that right 16 years ago. I can never tell John. How could he understand giving away our child when we've been trying so desperately for one of our own? John stared at the page, reading it once, twice, 3 times, waiting for the words to make sense. Our child. Thomas was their child. But that was impossible. He and Emily hadn't had children. The miscarriage had been their only pregnancy. Unless. The journal slipped from his numb fingers, falling open to another page. Sarah thinks I should tell John the truth. It's been 20 years, she says. Surely enough time has passed. But she doesn't understand. It's not about the time, it's about the hurt. John struggles enough with feeling inadequate. How would he feel knowing I had a child before him? A child I gave away. He'd wonder why I couldn't have one with him. Why fate was so cruel to give me a baby when I wasn't ready and deny me one when I was. And what if he wanted to find Thomas? What if it opened old wounds better left sealed? No, this secret is mine to carry. For everyone's sake. John closed the journal with trembling hands. His mind was spinning, trying to reconcile this new reality with everything he thought he knew about his wife. Emily had had a child. Before they met. A son she named Thomas. And she'd given him up for adoption. John barely slept that night. He tossed and turned, Emily's words from the journal replaying in his mind. By morning, exhaustion had settled into his bones, but adrenaline kept him moving. Riverside Coffee was busy with the morning rush when he arrived. He scanned the crowded tables until he spotted Sarah in a quiet corner, her blonde hair pulled back in a loose ponytail, 2 cups of coffee already on the table. She stood as he approached, embracing him with the familiar warmth that had always made her feel like family. But as she pulled back, John noticed the wariness in her eyes. She knew why he was here. "You look terrible," she said, gesturing for him to sit. "When's the last time you slept?" 1998, I think. John replied with a weak attempt at humor. He took the seat across from her, wrapping his hands around the coffee cup. "Thanks for meeting me." Sarah nodded, her expression guarded. "Your text sounded urgent. What's going on?" John reached into his coat pocket and pulled out Emily's letter, placing it on the table between them. "I found this yesterday. At the cemetery." Sarah's face paled as she recognized Emily's handwriting. Her fingers trembled slightly as she reached for it, but she didn't open it. "She wrote that you know about Thomas," John said, his voice low and controlled despite the storm raging inside him. "She said you could help me understand." Sarah closed her eyes briefly, as if gathering strength. When she opened them again, they were bright with unshed tears. "I told her to tell you years ago," she said softly. "She was so afraid of hurting you." "Who is he, Sarah?" The question came out more forcefully than John intended. "I found her journal. I know he's her son, a child she had before we met. But that's all I know." Sarah took a deep breath. "Yes, Thomas is Emily's biological son." She hesitated, glancing at the letter. "Did she explain the circumstances?" John shook his head. "The letter just mentions his name and says I should talk to you. The journal entries I found didn't give much detail either." Sarah nodded, as if making a decision. Emily was 19 when she got pregnant. Sophomore year of college. The father was, well, he wasn't in the picture. Emily was young, scared, with no support system except me. Her parents had made it clear they wouldn't help if she kept the baby. John tried to imagine Emily at 19, younger than when they'd met, facing such an enormous decision alone. His heart ached for her. She considered abortion, Sarah continued, but couldn't go through with it. Then she looked into adoption. There was this couple who couldn't have children of their own. They were kind, stable, everything Emily wanted for her baby. So she made the hardest decision of her life. "She gave him up," John whispered. Sarah nodded. It was a semi-open adoption. She received photos and updates for the first few years. Then the communication tapered off as he got older. The last she heard, he was doing well, happy, healthy, thriving with his adoptive family. John's mind was racing. But why keep it from me? Did she think I would judge her? No, Sarah said firmly. She knew you better than that. It wasn't about judgment. It was about pain, hers and yours. She hesitated. When you two were trying for a baby and nothing was happening. Then the miscarriage. Emily was devastated. She saw how much it hurt you, how much you wanted to be a father. She was afraid that knowing she'd had a child, given away a child, would make your pain worse. John stared into his coffee, letting the information sink in. All those years of trying, of monthly disappointments, of watching Emily blame herself for not being able to conceive again. And all the while, she'd been carrying this secret. There's something else, John. Sarah's voice had dropped to just above a whisper. Something Emily couldn't bring herself to tell you, even in that letter. John looked up, bracing himself. What? Thomas, he found her. About 4 years ago. The words hit John like a physical blow. What? How? He turned 18 and requested his adoption records. Emily was listed as the birth mother. He reached out through the agency, wanting to meet her. Sarah swallowed hard. They met a few times, secretly. She wanted to tell you, but then she got sick, and everything happened so fast. So where is he now? John asked, trying to keep his voice steady despite the emotions threatening to overwhelm him. He lives in Millridge. That's about 2 hours north of here. Works as a mechanic at his adoptive father's garage. Sarah reached into her purse and pulled out a small piece of paper. This is his contact information. Emily gave it to me before the end. She made me promise that if you ever found out, I'd help you find him. John stared at the paper, a name, address, and phone number written in Emily's familiar handwriting. Thomas Allen Reeves. Does he know about me? He asked, barely recognizing his own voice. Sarah nodded. Emily told him she was married, that her husband didn't know about him. She showed him your picture. A small, sad smile touched her lips. She said he has your laugh, though biologically that's impossible. John took the paper with Thomas's information, his hands unsteady. A flood of emotions washed over him. Hurt that Emily had kept this secret, anger that she'd met Thomas without telling him, grief for the years of shared connection they could have had. But beneath it all was something unexpected, curiosity. A desperate desire to meet this young man who had been part of Emily's life, to see the person she'd cared for from afar, to understand this final piece of Emily that had remained hidden from him. What should I do, Sarah? He asked, his voice breaking slightly. Sarah reached across the table and squeezed his hand. Only you can answer that, John. But I know Emily hoped you two would meet someday. That's why she left the letter. She wanted to give you both that chance, even if she couldn't be there to see it. John nodded slowly, tucking Thomas's information into his pocket alongside Emily's letter. Whatever decision he made, he wouldn't make it today, not with his emotions running so high. Thank you, he said to Sarah, for keeping her secret when she needed you to, and for telling me the truth now. As he walked out of the coffee shop into the bright morning sunlight, John felt as if he were seeing the world through new eyes. Everything looked the same streets, the same buildings, the same blue sky overhead, and yet nothing was as it had been before. Emily had had a son who was out there right now, living his life just 2 hours away. A son who had known Emily, spoken with her, perhaps even hugged her goodbye at their last meeting. John reached for his phone and dialed Claire's number. I need to talk, he said when she answered. Everything's changed. As he walked to his car, Emily's letter secure in his pocket, John finally understood what she'd meant in those final lines. Everything I did out of love, both for you and for him. Now he had to decide what to do with that love she'd left behind. The drive home from the coffee shop was a blur. John barely registered the familiar streets, his mind caught in a storm of memories and questions. He pulled into his driveway and sat in the car, engine off, staring at nothing. Thomas, Emily's son, a young man who existed in the world, who carried half of Emily's DNA, who had met her and spoken with her while John remained oblivious. The thought stung more than he expected. When he finally entered the house, Claire was waiting. She'd let herself in with the spare key, a habit formed during those dark months after Emily's death, when leaving John alone seemed dangerous. Her expression told him she'd been worried. You talked to Sarah, she said. Not a question. John nodded, sinking into the armchair across from her. Thomas is Emily's son. She had him in college, gave him up for adoption. He recounted everything Sarah had told him, watching Claire's eyes widen with each revelation. When he mentioned that Emily had met Thomas secretly, Claire's hand flew to her mouth. "Oh, John," she whispered. "All that time, she carried this alone." "Not alone," John corrected, a bitter edge to his voice. "She had Sarah. And eventually, she had Thomas too. Just not me." Claire studied him with the careful attention of someone approaching a wounded animal. "What are you going to do?" John pulled out the slip of paper with Thomas's information. "I don't know." His voice cracked. "Part of me wants to drive to Mill Ridge right now. But what would I even say? Hi, I'm your mother's husband. The one she never told about you until after she died? Maybe start with a phone call," Claire suggested gently. But John shook his head. This wasn't a conversation for phones. This was about Emily, about a piece of her life he'd never known, about a connection that extended beyond death. "I need time," he said finally, "to process all this." That night, John found himself back in Emily's office, the journal open in his lap. He was reading every entry that mentioned Thomas, piecing together a chronology of Emily's secret life. The earliest entries were heart-wrenching. A 19-year-old girl facing an impossible choice, determined to give her baby a better life than she could provide. Later entries revealed her quiet grief on his birthdays, her pride when Sarah found a newspaper clipping about Thomas winning a regional science fair. And then, the entry that changed everything. "He found me. My Thomas found me. After all these years of wondering, of watching from a distance, he reached out through the adoption agency. He wants to meet. I can hardly breathe thinking about it. What do I tell John? How do I explain that I've kept this secret for over 2 decades? That while we've been trying for a child together, I've had a son out there all along? I can't tell him. Not yet. Not when he's finally doing better after last year's episode. I'll meet Thomas first, just once. Then I'll find the right moment to tell John everything." That right moment never came. According to the journal, Emily and Thomas met 3 times before her diagnosis. Their last meeting was 2 weeks before the doctor confirmed the cancer had spread to her liver. After that, the entries focused on her illness, her fear of leaving John alone, her regret that she'd never found the courage to bring the 2 men together. The final entry about Thomas was dated just days before she died. "Sarah will help John find Thomas when the time is right. I've made her promise. They're the 2 people I've loved most in this world, in such different ways. I hope someday they can know each other. I hope John can forgive me for keeping this secret. I hope Thomas understands why I couldn't be the mother he deserved. Tom has run out for me to make this right. All I can do is leave behind the truth and hope that it brings healing rather than more pain." John closed the journal, tears streaming down his face. For the first time since finding the letter, anger wasn't his dominant emotion. Instead, he felt overwhelming sadness for Emily's silent struggle, for Thomas's complicated history, for his own ignorance of something so fundamental to his wife's identity. A week passed. John called in sick to work, spending his days alternating between poring over Emily's journal and staring at Thomas's contact information. Claire checked on him daily, bringing food he barely touched and concern he couldn't ease. "You can't stay in limbo forever," she told him on the 7th day. "Emily wanted you to meet him. That's why she left the letter." "What if he doesn't want to meet me?" John asked, voicing the fear that had been growing. "Maybe he's moved on. Maybe meeting Emily was enough for him." Claire shook her head. "You won't know unless you try." That evening, after Claire left, John found himself pulling out a box of old photographs. Wedding photos, vacation snapshots, everyday moments captured throughout their marriage. Emily's smile, consistent through the years, bright, genuine, loving. Had that smile been haunted by her secret? Had there been moments when she'd almost told him, only to lose her nerve? At the bottom of the box, he found an envelope he didn't recognize. Inside was a single photograph he'd never seen before. Emily sitting on a park bench beside a young man with dark hair and familiar blue eyes. They weren't touching, weren't even looking at each other in the candid shot. But something in their identical profiles, the way they both leaned forward slightly, elbows on knees, spoke of a connection that transcended their brief acquaintance. On the back, in Emily's handwriting, "Thomas and me, River Park, August 2021. Just 5 months before she died." John stared at the photo for a long time, taking in every detail of the young man's face. He looked to be in his early 20s, with Emily's eyes and chin, but a stronger jaw, broader shoulders. He was smiling slightly, as if someone had just said something amusing. This was her son, the child she'd carried and given birth to long before she met John. The secret she'd protected out of love and fear. In that moment, John made his decision. He reached for his phone and dialed Claire. "I'm going to Mill Ridge tomorrow," he said when she answered. "I need to meet him. Do you want me to come with you?" Claire asked. John looked again at the photograph, at Emily and Thomas sitting side by side, connected by blood and separated by circumstance. "No," he said quietly. "This is something I need to do alone." As he hung up, John felt something shift inside him. Not healing, not yet, but movement. A step away from anger and toward understanding. Away from betrayal and toward compassion. Emily had loved this young man enough to make the hardest choice a mother could make. She had loved John enough to try to protect him from pain, even at the cost of her own honesty. Now it was his turn to honor both of those loves, in the only way left to him. John carefully placed the photo in his wallet. Tomorrow, he would drive to Mill Ridge. Tomorrow, he would meet Thomas. Tomorrow, he would begin to understand the full dimensions of his wife's heart. Mill Ridge was smaller than John had expected, a quiet town with a main street that looked like it hadn't changed in decades. Reeves Auto Repair sat at the edge of town, a well-maintained garage with a small office attached. The sign above the entrance was hand-painted, the letters slightly uneven but carefully drawn. John parked across the street, his heart hammering against his ribs. He'd rehearsed what to say 100 times during the 2-hour drive, but now that he was here, the words evaporated like morning dew. Through the large garage door, he could see someone working under a raised car. Another man stood nearby, handing over tools when requested. Father and son, perhaps? The older man gestured to something, and the younger one slid out from beneath the vehicle. Even from this distance, John recognized him immediately from the photograph. Thomas. For a moment, John considered driving away. He could return to his empty house, to the grief he knew how to navigate, to the comfortable isolation he'd built around himself. Meeting Thomas would change everything, opening doors that could never be closed again. But Emily had wanted this. In her final days, knowing she would soon be gone, she had left breadcrumbs for him to follow. The letter, Sarah's confession, the photograph. She'd wanted the two men she loved to know each other. John took a deep breath and stepped out of the car. The bell above the office door jangled as he entered. The older man John had seen in the garage looked up from a computer, his weathered face breaking into a practiced smile. "Help you with something?" he asked. "I'm looking for Thomas," John replied, his voice steadier than he expected. The man's eyebrows rose slightly. "You got an appointment?" "He's pretty booked up today." "No, it's personal," John said. "I'm John Harris. I was Emily's husband." Recognition dawned on the man's face, followed quickly by caution. "You're Emily's husband?" "Yes," John confirmed. "I recently found out about Thomas. I'd like to speak with him, if that's possible." The man studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "I'm Robert Reeves, Thomas's father." He extended a hand, which John shook. "I'll get him for you." As Robert disappeared into the garage, John looked around the small office. Photos lined one wall. Thomas as a child in Little League uniform, as a teenager holding a trophy, in cap and gown at graduation. A lifetime of moments Emily had missed. Moments John had never known existed. The door opened, and Thomas stepped into the office, wiping his hands on a shop rag. He was taller in person, his resemblance to Emily even more striking. "Mr. Harris?" he said, uncertainty in his voice. "John," he corrected automatically. "Call me John." Thomas nodded, glancing at his father, who gave him a reassuring look before stepping out to give them privacy. An awkward silence fell between them. "I'm sorry to show up like this," John finally said. "I found a letter from Emily last week. At her grave." Thomas's expression softened. "She told me she was going to write to you." Before he trailed off, unable to say the word. "You knew her," John said, the reality of it hitting him anew. "You met her?" Thomas nodded. "For times. He swallowed hard. "She was kind. She answered all my questions about where I came from. She never tried to replace my parents or insert herself into my life. She just wanted me to know I wasn't abandoned, that I was loved." The words struck John like physical blows. Emily, his Emily, meeting this young man in secret, answering his questions, trying to heal old wounds without creating new ones. "I wish she had told me," John said quietly. "About you. About meeting you." Thomas looked down. She wanted to. The last time we met, she said she was going to tell you everything. But then she got sick, and he met John's eyes. She was afraid of hurting you. She said you'd been through enough. John felt tears building and didn't try to stop them. That sounds like Emily. Always protecting everyone but herself. Thomas smiled slightly. She talked about you a lot. Said you were the best man she'd ever known. A small, broken laugh escaped John. I don't know about that. An uncomfortable silence stretched between them, filled with unasked questions and uncertain futures. Would you like to get coffee? John finally asked. Or lunch? I'd like to hear more about your meetings with Emily. If that's okay. Thomas hesitated, then nodded. Let me tell my dad I'm taking a break. They sat in a small diner a few blocks from the garage, two strangers connected by a woman neither of them had fully known. Thomas ordered coffee black, just like Emily had always taken it. The similarity wasn't lost on John. Tell me about yourself, John said. What do you do besides work at the garage? Thomas seemed surprised by the question. I'm taking night classes at the community college. Engineering. I've always been good with machines. Emily was terrible with anything mechanical, John said with a small smile. She could manage complex medical procedures, but couldn't change a light bulb to save her life. Thomas laughed, a warm sound that reminded John of Emily in a way he couldn't quite define. She told me that. Said she hoped I got my mechanical abilities from my biological father because she couldn't even program the coffee maker. The mention of Thomas's biological father hung in the air between them. John had wondered, but hadn't asked Sarah. Did she tell you about him? John asked carefully. Thomas nodded. A college boyfriend. He didn't know about me. She said they broke up before she found out she was pregnant, and she never told him. He paused. She made it clear she didn't regret her choice. She said giving me to my parents was the hardest and best decision she ever made. John nodded, thinking of the journal entries, of Emily's words written in moments of private reflection. Your parents seem like good people. The best, Thomas agreed without hesitation. They told me I was adopted when I was 8. They always supported my curiosity about my birth mother, even helped me find her when I turned 18. He smiled sadly. They were worried about me meeting her, afraid she might hurt me somehow. But they came around when they saw how much it meant to both of us. John studied the young man across from him. In him, he could see pieces of Emily, her eyes, her expressions, the thoughtful way she'd had of choosing her words. But Thomas was his own person, shaped by the family who had raised him, by experiences Emily and John had never shared. I brought something for you, John said, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out a small envelope and handed it to Thomas. Photos of Emily, from throughout her life. I thought you might want them. Thomas took the envelope with careful hands, opening it to reveal a dozen photographs John had selected. Emily as a teenager, in college, on their wedding day, hiking in Colorado last summer before the diagnosis. A visual timeline of the mother he'd barely known. Thank you, Thomas said, his voice thick with emotion. This means a lot. John nodded, watching as Thomas looked through the photos, pausing on one of Emily laughing on their back porch, her face tilted toward the sun. It had been taken just months before she got sick. She loved the sunshine, John said. Even in winter, she'd find any patch of sunlight in the house and sit there like a cat. Thomas smiled. She told me about your backyard, the garden she planted, the bird feeders you built her. The realization that Emily had shared these intimate details of their life together with Thomas brought a fresh wave of emotion. She'd been building a bridge between them long before John knew it existed. I'm sorry I didn't know about you sooner, John said quietly. That we couldn't meet while she was still here. Thomas looked up from the photos, his eyes, Emily's eyes, bright with unshed tears. She worried about that too. The last time we met, she made me promise something. What's that? John asked. She made me promise that if you ever found out about me, if you ever reached out. Thomas's voice wavered slightly. She wanted me to tell you that keeping me a secret wasn't about not trusting you. It was about not knowing how to bring together two separate parts of her life without hurting everyone involved. John nodded, his throat too tight for words. That was Emily, always thinking of others, always trying to minimize pain, even when it meant carrying heavy burdens alone. I'd like to know you, Thomas, he said finally. Not to replace your family or to force a connection that isn't there, but because you were important to Emily, and because I think she would have wanted us to try. Thomas looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. I'd like that too. As they exchanged phone numbers and made tentative plans for Thomas to visit John's home the following month, John felt something shift inside him. Not healing, not yet, but the beginning of it. A crack in the wall of grief he'd built around himself. Emily was gone. Nothing could change that devastating fact. But here, sitting across from her son, John could see that parts of her lived on. In Thomas's smile, in the compassionate way he spoke, in the careful way he handled her photographs. It wasn't the future John had imagined. But as he watched Thomas tuck the envelope of photos carefully into his jacket pocket, he thought perhaps it was the future Emily had hoped for them both. Spring arrived with a gentle insistence, coaxing color back into the world. In John's garden, Emily's perennials pushed through the soil, crocuses, then daffodils, then tulips, as if she had orchestrated their appearance from beyond. It had been 3 months since John first drove to Millridge. 3 months of cautious text messages and occasional phone calls with Thomas. 3 months of building something neither of them could quite name. Not quite friendship, not quite family, but something uniquely their own. Today, Thomas was coming to visit the house. John stood in the kitchen, nervously rearranging the coffee mugs for the 3rd time. He'd spent the week cleaning, making the house presentable in a way it hadn't been since Emily died. The dusty corners had been swept, the fridge stocked, the guest room prepared. The doorbell rang at exactly noon. When John opened the door, Thomas stood on the porch, a leather-bound book tucked under his arm and uncertainty in his eyes. "You found it okay?" John asked, stepping aside to let him in. Thomas nodded. "GPS makes everything easy." He paused in the entryway, taking in the photographs on the wall, most featuring Emily, her smile immortalized in various moments throughout their marriage. "She looks happy," Thomas said softly. "In all of these." "She was," John replied, leading the way to the kitchen. "Most of the time, anyway. We had our rough patches like anyone else." As John poured coffee, Thomas sat at the kitchen table, the book still clutched in his hands. An awkward silence settled between them, heavy with unspoken thoughts. "I brought something," Thomas finally said, placing the book on the table. "My parents made this for me when I was 16, when I started asking more questions about where I came from." John sat across from him as Thomas opened the book. It was a scrapbook, meticulously assembled with photographs, handwritten notes, and mementos. "My adoption story," Thomas explained. "Mom, my adoptive mom, thought it was important for me to understand my journey." He turned the pages carefully. "I thought you might want to see it." John's throat tightened as he looked at the first page, a copy of Thomas's birth certificate, with Emily listed as the mother. The next pages chronicled the adoption process through letters and legal documents, all carefully preserved. "Your parents did all this for you?" John asked, touched by the obvious care that had gone into the book. Thomas nodded. "They wanted me to know I was chosen, not abandoned, that I was loved by both my birth mother and them." As they turned the pages together, John saw Thomas's childhood unfold, his first steps, school plays, baseball games, family vacations. A life filled with love and stability, exactly what Emily had hoped for when she made her difficult choice. "You had a good childhood," John said, the statement somewhere between a question and an observation. "The best," Thomas confirmed. "My parents are amazing people. They never made me feel different or like I didn't belong." "Emily would have been grateful," John said quietly. "All she ever wanted was for you to be happy." Thomas looked up, meeting John's eyes. "She told me about the miscarriage, about how you both tried for years to have children." He hesitated. "I hope knowing about me doesn't make that pain worse." The honesty of the statement caught John off guard. In the early days after discovering Emily's secret, the knowledge had indeed sharpened his grief over their childlessness. But now, sitting across from this thoughtful young man who carried pieces of Emily with him, John found the pain had transformed into something else. Not gone, but different. "It was hard at first," John admitted. "Not because of you, but because she kept it secret. But now," he paused, searching for the right words. "Now I think I understand why she did it. And meeting you has been a gift, Thomas. A completely unexpected gift." Thomas smiled, relief evident in his expression. "I felt guilty," he confessed, "for having these secret meetings with her, for being part of what she kept from you." "You have nothing to feel guilty about," John assured him. "Emily made her choices. She was trying to protect everyone's feelings in her own way." They continued through the scrapbook, pausing at a recent addition, the photograph of Emily and Thomas in the park, the same one John had found in Emily's things. My mom added this, Thomas said. After Emily died, she thought it was important to include it. John was struck by the generosity of Thomas's adoptive mother, her willingness to acknowledge Emily's place in her son's life. I'd like to meet them someday, John said. Your parents? Thomas nodded. They'd like that too. They've been curious about you. As the afternoon progressed, they moved from the kitchen to the living room, then to the backyard. John showed Thomas the garden Emily had planted, the bird feeders she'd loved, the hammock where she'd spent countless summer afternoons reading. She talked about this place like it was heaven, Thomas said, looking around the modestly sized yard with its blooming flowers and budding trees. Now I can see why. It was our sanctuary, John agreed, especially during her illness. As they stood side by side, watching a pair of cardinals at the feeder, Thomas asked the question John had been expecting all day. Do you think we could have known each other? If she hadn't gotten sick? If she'd had time to tell you about me? John considered the question carefully. I'd like to think so, he said finally. It would have been a shock, sure. I probably would have been hurt at first. But Emily knew me better than anyone. If she thought I could handle it, I probably could have. Thomas nodded, seeming satisfied with the answer. I've been thinking about her a lot lately, wondering what she'd think of us, you and me, getting to know each other like this. John smiled. I think she'd be relieved. And happy. As the afternoon light began to fade, they moved back inside. John showed Thomas his workshop in the garage, where he built birdhouses and small furniture pieces as a hobby. To his surprise, Thomas immediately engaged with the projects, asking knowledgeable questions about joinery and wood types. Maybe next time you visit, we could build something together, John suggested. I've been thinking about making a new bench for the garden. I'd like that, Thomas replied, his eyes brightening at the invitation. When it was time for Thomas to leave, John walked him to his car. There was a moment of awkwardness as they faced each other, neither quite sure how to say goodbye. Thank you, John said simply. For coming today? For sharing your scrapbook? Thomas nodded. Thank you for inviting me. He gestured vaguely. All of this. On impulse, John stepped forward and embraced him briefly. It was the first time they'd touched beyond a handshake, and for a moment, John felt the ghost of Emily between them, connecting them in ways neither could fully articulate. As Thomas drove away, John stood in the driveway, watching until the car disappeared around the corner. The emptiness that had been his constant companion since Emily's death still lingered, but it was changing shape, making room for something new. He looked up at the house they'd shared, at the garden she'd loved, at the life they'd built together. I found him, Em, he whispered to the evening air. Just like you wanted. Somewhere, he liked to think, she was smiling. 1 year to the day after finding Emily's letter, John returned to the cemetery. The morning was gentler than it had been a year ago, the air soft with spring warmth, wildflowers nodding in the breeze, birdsong filling the spaces between his thoughts. He wasn't alone this time. Thomas walked beside him, carrying a bouquet of white roses. They moved in comfortable silence through the rows of headstones until they reached Emily's grave. The granite was the same, but John was different. The man who had stood here a year ago, crushed by grief and blindsided by betrayal, had been transformed by the journey that began with a folded piece of paper. I still come every Sunday, John said as they stood before the headstone. Old habits. Thomas nodded, carefully placing the roses against the stone. My parents took me to visit my grandfather's grave every Memorial Day when I was growing up. I never understood the point until now. It's not really for them, John replied. It's for us. They stood in silence for a moment, each lost in their own memories of the woman who connected them. It amazed John how much his perception of Emily had changed over the past year. The perfect image he'd preserved after her death had given way to something more complex, more human, a woman who made difficult choices, who carried secret burdens, who loved imperfectly but completely. I found something yesterday, John said, reaching into his pocket. I was going through some old boxes in the attic and found this. He pulled out a small, worn envelope and handed it to Thomas. Inside was a hospital bracelet and a tiny lock of dark hair wrapped in tissue paper. From when you were born, John explained. She kept it all these years. Thomas held the fragile mementos with careful hands, emotion washing over his face. She never even held me, he said softly. She told me she asked the nurses to take me away immediately, afraid she'd change her mind if she did. John nodded. That sounds like Emily. Once she made a difficult decision, she did whatever was necessary to follow through. Thomas carefully returned the precious items to the envelope and handed it back to John. You should keep these. I thought you might want them. Thomas shook his head. I have my scrapbook, my adoptive parents' love, and now these new memories with you. I don't need physical reminders of that day. He paused. But thank you for showing me. John tucked the envelope back into his pocket. Over the past year, he and Thomas had developed a relationship neither could have anticipated. Not quite father and son, not mere friends, but family in a way that defied conventional labels. They'd built the garden bench together during the summer, Thomas's engineering skills complementing John's woodworking experience. They'd spent Thanksgiving together, along with Claire's family and Thomas's adoptive parents, an unlikely gathering that somehow worked despite its complicated origins. And now they stood together at Emily's grave, marking an anniversary that had changed both their lives. I brought something too, John said, pulling an envelope from his other pocket. It was Emily's letter, the one that had started everything. I thought we could leave it here with her. A way of saying we fulfilled her wish. Thomas nodded, understanding the symbolism of the gesture. She'd be happy, I think, seeing us here together. John carefully placed the letter at the base of the headstone, weighing it down with a small stone to keep the spring breeze from carrying it away. The simple act felt momentous, a closing of one chapter and the acknowledgement of another. I've been thinking about something, John said as they stepped back. The house is too big for just me. I've been considering selling it, maybe finding a smaller place. Oh, Thomas replied, surprise evident in his voice. That's a big decision. John nodded. Emily and I bought that house planning to fill it with children. Now it's just me rattling around in all those empty rooms. He paused. But before I made any decisions, I wanted to make sure you'd had a chance to know it. To see the place where she lived, where she was happy. I appreciate that, Thomas said. But you don't need to keep the house for my sake. I have my memories of her now, both the ones she gave me directly and the ones you've shared. They began walking back toward the cemetery gate, the morning sun warming their shoulders. What would you do if you sold the house? Thomas asked. I've been thinking about getting a place with a proper workshop, John admitted. Something with more garage space, less house. Claire thinks it would be good for me to have a fresh start. She's probably right, Thomas agreed. Change can be healing. As they reached their cars, parked side by side in the small cemetery lot, Thomas hesitated. Before we go, there's something I've been wanting to ask you. John waited, giving him space to find the words. What do I call you? Thomas asked, his voice carrying a vulnerability that reminded John sharply of Emily. I've been avoiding calling you anything directly. It feels strange to call you John, but you're not exactly. I'm not your father, John finished gently. No, I understand the dilemma. The question hung between them, laden with significance. Thomas had loving parents who had raised him, Robert and Catherine Reeves, whose generosity had allowed Thomas to build this connection with John without jealousy or resentment. John had no desire to displace them in Thomas's life. And yet, over the past year, something undeniably paternal had grown in John's heart. A protective affection, a pride in Thomas's accomplishments, a desire to be there for him in whatever capacity made sense. Whatever you're comfortable with is fine, John said finally. I'm honored to be in your life, regardless of what you call me. Thomas nodded, seeming to wrestle with something internally. My parents suggested Uncle John at one point, he said with a small smile. But that doesn't quite fit either. John smiled too, touched by the thought that Thomas had discussed this with his parents, that they were all trying to navigate this unconventional relationship with Grace. You know, John said thoughtfully, Emily would probably have a perfect solution for this. She always knew what to say in awkward situations. Thomas laughed softly. She did have a way with words. He sobered. I wish I'd had more time with her. Me too, John agreed. For both of us. As they stood in the morning sunlight, birds singing in the trees around them, John felt Emily's presence more strongly than he had in months. Not as a ghost or a supernatural visitation, but as the living force that had brought them together, that continued to shape their lives even in her absence. Whatever you want to call me, John said sincerely. I'm just glad you're in my life, Thomas. You've helped me see Emily more clearly, more completely. And you've given me something I never expected to find after losing her, family. Thomas's eyes brightened with emotion. You too, he said simply. Then, after a brief hesitation, he stepped forward and embraced John. No longer the awkward hug of strangers connected by circumstance, but the warm embrace of people who had chosen to be in each other's lives. As they pulled apart, Thomas smiled. For now, I think I'll just call you John, and we can figure out the rest as we go. John nodded, a weight lifting from his heart. That sounds perfect. They parted ways with plans to meet again the following weekend. John would help Thomas with some repairs on his first house, a fixer-upper he'd recently purchased near his parents' home. Driving away from the cemetery, John glanced in his rearview mirror at Emily's grave, now smaller with distance, but no less significant. The letter he'd left there contained the beginning of their story. What lay ahead would be entirely their own. I found him, Em, he whispered one last time. And in finding him, I think I found myself again too. The road stretched before him, curving into a future he couldn't have imagined a year ago. A future where grief remained, but no longer defined him. Where Emily's memory lived on not just in photographs and keepsakes, but in the living connection between the two men who had loved her most. And for the first time in a very long while, John felt a sense of peace. A new beginning wrapped in old wounds, slowly but surely healing.